A millionaire woman is taken aback when she notices her black maid wearing a necklace that she thought was lost forever. As the truth unfolds, old memories resurface, changing their relationship forever. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum buzzed with the familiar sounds of wealth, crystal glasses clinking, expensive jewelry catching light, and the particular laughter that comes with complete financial security. Victoria Grant stood near the champagne fountain, holding court with her usual circle of socialites. Her perfectly tailored Valentino dress and impeccable posture marked her as someone born into this world of privilege. The annual Children's Hospital fundraiser was Victoria's signature event. She had orchestrated every detail, from the custom ice sculptures to the strategic seating arrangements that would encourage maximum donation potential. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned until she caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. The necklace. Victoria nearly dropped her champagne glass when she saw it gleaming around Angela Brown's neck. Angela, her housekeeper of 5 years, moved efficiently between guests, serving hors d'oeuvres with practiced grace. But it was the delicate gold chain with its distinctive emerald pendant that captured Victoria's attention. The same necklace she had torn her house apart looking for 3 months ago. The same necklace her mother had pressed in her hands on her deathbed. "Victoria, are you feeling all right?" Margaret Winchester, her closest friend, touched her arm with concern. "You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," Victoria managed, but her eyes never left Angela. The necklace caught the light as Angela moved, the emerald sending familiar green flashes across the room. Victoria had spent countless childhood hours watching that same play of light as her mother wore it to similar functions. The rest of the gala passed in a blur. Victoria maintained her social obligations through muscle memory alone, her mind racing with questions. How did Angela get the necklace? Why was she wearing it so openly? Had she stolen it? The thought made Victoria's stomach turn, not just because of the theft, but because she had trusted Angela implicitly for years. After the last guest departed, Victoria found Angela in the mansion's kitchen, carefully storing leftover catering supplies. The contrast between their positions had never felt more stark. Victoria still in her designer gown, Angela in her serviceable black uniform. "Angela." Victoria's voice was quiet but firm. "We need to discuss the necklace you're wearing." Angela's hand flew to her throat, touching the emerald pendant. Her usually composed face showed a flash of fear before settling into careful neutrality. "Mrs. Grant, I can explain. Please do." Victoria moved closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Because that necklace belonged to my mother. It disappeared from my jewelry box 3 months ago. I'd very much like to know how it ended up around your neck." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Angela's fingers remained on the necklace, as if protecting it. "Mrs. Grant, this necklace. It came from my grandfather's effects. When he passed away last month, I found it in a box of family heirlooms." Victoria felt her carefully maintained composure slipping. "That's impossible. My mother gave me this necklace on her deathbed. I've had it for 20 years. The memory surfaced unbidden. Her mother, Eleanor Grant, once just as commanding a presence as Victoria herself, reduced to a fragile figure in a hospital bed. But even then, Eleanor had maintained her principles. Victoria could still hear her mother's voice, weak but insistent. "Remember, Victoria, true worth isn't in what we own, but in how we treat others. Is necklace. It's not just jewelry. It's a reminder." Young Victoria had nodded, too grief-stricken to truly absorb the words. Now, standing in her kitchen facing Angela, those words took on a new weight. Her mother had always insisted on treating their household staff with respect, even when other society women sneered at such consideration. "Mrs. Grant," Angela's voice broke through Victoria's memories. "I would never steal from you. You know me better than that. There must be some explanation." Victoria studied Angela's face, the same face she had trusted with her home, her confidences, and countless small kindnesses over the years. Either Angela was an exceptional liar, or there was something deeper happening here. something that connected their families in ways Victoria had never imagined. "Show me," Victoria said finally. "Show me this box of your grandfather's. Show me where you found it." The command came out harsher than intended, but Angela straightened her shoulders and nodded. Whatever was happening here, both women recognized that their relationship had shifted irrevocably. The careful balance of employer and employee had been disrupted by a simple gold chain and an emerald pendant that somehow belonged to both their histories. Angela's basement apartment, accessed through a discreet side entrance of the Grant mansion, stood in stark contrast to the opulent rooms above. Where Victoria's spaces gleamed with marble and crystal, Angela's home remained humble but dignified, filled with well-worn furniture and carefully preserved family photos. Victoria stood awkwardly in the doorway, feeling oddly invasive in a space she technically owned but had never visited. Angela moved with purpose to a weathered cedar chest tucked beneath her window. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. "My grandfather passed 3 weeks ago," Angela explained, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "He was 92, the last of his generation in our family." She began carefully removing items: old photographs, letters tied with faded ribbon, a man's pocket watch. Victoria watched, her impatience warring with an unexpected fascination. Each object Angela removed seemed to carry its own weight of history. Finally, Angela lifted out a simple wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. "This is where I found it," Angela said, opening the box. Inside, nestled in velvet that had once been green but had faded to a muted gray, lay several pieces of jewelry. Most were simple, clearly old, but unremarkable. Angela carefully moved these aside to reveal a folded piece of paper. "The necklace was wrapped in this," she said, holding out the paper to Victoria. "I haven't been able to bring myself to read it yet." Victoria took the paper, noting its age-yellowed edges. Her fingers hesitated over the fold. Why with a necklace tonight, of all nights? Angela's shoulders tensed. I felt drawn to it. Something about tonight's event. The way everyone would be there, watching. I thought maybe... She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "You thought what?" Victoria pressed, the paper still unread in her hands. "I thought maybe someone would recognize it. Maybe someone would know something about how my grandfather came to have it." Angela's admission came out in a rush. "I never meant to upset you, Mrs. Grant. I should have asked first, but I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid you'd think I'd stolen it." Angela gestured to the box. "There's more. Photos, letters, things I don't understand. My grandfather never talked much about the past, but he made me promise to keep this box safe. He said it contained our family's true history." Victoria finally unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant but faded, the ink brown with age. She squinted to make out the words, then felt her breath catch. The date at the top was from 1963. "Mrs. Grant." Angela's voice seemed to come far away. "Are you all right?" Victoria sank onto Angela's worn sofa, her designer dress forgotten. The letter in her hands began, "My dearest friend, if you are reading this, then the time has finally come for the truth to emerge." The sound of footsteps overhead made both women start. The catering staff was still cleaning up from the gala, their movements a reminder of the world beyond this basement room and its mysteries. "I need time," Victoria said abruptly, folding the letter and slipping it into her clutch. "To read this, to think, to understand." Angela nodded, but her hand went protectively to the necklace again. "Of course, but please, it's all I have left of him, of my family's history." Victoria stood, smoothing her dress with hands that weren't quite steady. The familiar action helped her regain some composure, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The careful order of her world, where everything and everyone had their proper place, was beginning to crumble. "Keep the necklace for now," she said finally. "But Angela, no more secrets. Whatever this is, whatever connection exists between our families, I need to know everything." "There's one more thing," Angela said as Victoria turned to leave. "My grandfather, in his final days, he mentioned your mother's name, Eleanor. He said she would understand about the necklace. Victoria froze in the doorway. Her mother, who had always insisted on treating their staff with unusual respect. Her mother, who had given her the necklace with words about worth and treating others well. Her mother, who might have known far more than she had ever revealed. Tomorrow, Victoria said, not turning around. We'll talk tomorrow. She climbed the stairs to her world of privilege and power, but each step felt less certain than before. In her clutch, the letter seemed to burn against her hip, a promise, or perhaps a threat, of revelations to come. Victoria spent the night reading and rereading the letter until its words burned into her memory. By morning, she had dark circles under her eyes and a new understanding of why Angela had been so protective of the necklace. She found Angela in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as usual, though the normalcy of the scene now felt like a thin veneer over something much more complex. Your grandmother was Dorothy Brown, Victoria said without preamble, watching Angela's hands still over the coffee maker. She marched with Dr. King. Angela turned slowly, her face a careful mask. Yes, though that's not something I usually share with employers. Sit down. Victoria gestured to the kitchen island. Please, she added, softer this time. I think it's time we talk properly. Angela hesitated, then pulled out a stool. The kitchen filled with morning light, highlighting the stark difference between Victoria's silk robe and Angela's work uniform. But for the first time, Victoria found herself truly seeing past these external markers. My grandmother wasn't just another face in the crowd, Angela began, her voice gaining strength. She organized sit-ins at segregated lunch counters. She registered voters despite death threats. The necklace, according to my grandfather's letters, it was given to her by a white ally in the movement. Someone who believed in equality enough to risk their social standing to support the cause. Victoria's fingers traced the edge of the letter. My mother was 19 in 1963. She had just debuted in society, was expected to marry well, and maintain the family's social position. Instead, according to this letter, she was secretly attending civil rights meetings. Your mother? Angela's composure cracked slightly, showing genuine surprise. Eleanor Grant, social butterfly and secret activist. Victoria laughed, but the sound held more wonder than humor. The letter mentions a promise made between two women, your grandmother and my mother. A promise symbolized by this necklace. Angela touched the emerald pendant that still hung around her neck. But why didn't they tell us? Why keep it secret for so long? Victoria stood abruptly, moving to the window. The grounds of her estate stretched out before her, immaculately maintained, a symbol of the privilege she'd inherited. Those were dangerous times, for both of them in different ways. My mother could have been ostracized from society, lost everything. Your grandmother could have lost her life. But times have changed, Angela said quietly. Have they? Victoria turned back. Look at us now, still operating in these prescribed roles. Employer and employee, upper class and working class, white and black. All these invisible lines we're not supposed to cross. Angela straightened her spine. My grandmother crossed those lines. She believed they were artificial constructs designed to keep people apart, to maintain power structures. And my mother helped her, in secret. Victoria moved to her office adjacent to the kitchen, returning with her laptop. I want to know more. About your grandmother, about my mother's involvement. About everything they fought for and why this necklace mattered so much to both of them. They spent the morning in the library, social obligations forgotten. Victoria accessed historical archives online, while Angela shared her grandfather's letters and photographs. The image of Dorothy Brown emerged, a fierce young woman with Angela's eyes and unwavering determination. Photos showed her at protests, at community meetings, always in the thick of the action. Look at this, Angela said suddenly, pointing to the background of one photograph. There, barely visible in the crowd, stood a young Eleanor Grant, her face half hidden but recognizable to her daughter. She never told me, Victoria whispered. All those charity events she organized, the committees she chaired. Was she continuing the work in her own way? Maybe she thought she could do more good from inside the system, Angela suggested. Change things gradually, using her influence. Victoria thought about her own charity work, the careful dance of social obligations and power dynamics. Had she been unconsciously following her mother's path, or merely playing the role expected of her? "There's more," Angela said, pulling out another letter. "My grandmother and your mother, they had a plan, something bigger than just secret support for the movement, something they needed the necklace for." Before she could continue, the library door opened. Clara Winchester, Victoria's social rival, stood in the doorway, her surprise at finding them together quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Victoria, darling, I tried calling. What's all this?" Her eyes swept over the scattered documents and photographs, lingering on Angela seated comfortably in one of the library's leather chairs. Victoria felt Angela tense beside her, but something had shifted. The old instinct to maintain appearances, to quickly establish proper distance between herself and her housekeeper, didn't come. "Family history research," Victoria said simply, meeting Clara's gaze with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "Angela's grandmother and my mother knew each other. We're discovering quite a remarkable connection." Clara's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How interesting. I didn't realize you were interested in that sort of history." "That sort of history shaped all of our lives, whether we acknowledge it or not," Victoria replied, her mother's strength suddenly flowing through her veins. "Would you like to join us? We were just getting to a fascinating part about the civil rights movement in our own community." Clara backed away slightly. "Another time, perhaps. I just wanted to discuss the hospital board meeting, but I can see you're occupied." After she left, Angela let out a breath. "That was bold of you." "Maybe it's time for some boldness," Victoria said, turning back to the letters. "Tell me more about this plan our grandmothers had. Tell me everything." The local history museum was quiet on Tuesday morning, their footsteps echoing through empty halls. Victoria had insisted they come during off hours, using her position as a board member to arrange private access. What they discovered would shake both women's understanding of their shared history. "Here," the curator, Dr. Thompson, said, carefully laying out a series of photographs from the museum's archives. These were donated anonymously in the 1970s. They document various civil rights activities in our community. Victoria and Angela leaned forward, examining each black and white image. Then Angela gasped. There, in a photograph dated June 1963, was a clear shot of Dorothy Brown addressing a crowd. Around her neck hung the emerald necklace. "Look at the date," Victoria said, her voice tight. "This was taken 3 days before the downtown protests. The ones that turned violent." Dr. Thompson adjusted his glasses. "Ah yes, a pivotal moment in our city's history. The peaceful protest that turned into chaos when local law enforcement." He trailed off, noticing the women's intense focus on the photograph. "Can you enhance this section?" Victoria pointed to the crowd behind Dorothy. The curator nodded, using his tablet to zoom in on the digital scan. As the image cleared, they could see Eleanor Grant standing in the crowd, her face partially obscured but recognizable. She was passing something to Dorothy, a piece of paper. "There's more," Dr. Thompson said, pulling out another folder. "We recently digitized a series of letters from various civil rights organizers. One mentioned a green beacon that helped guide people to safe houses during the unrest." Angela's hand went to the necklace. The emerald. They used it as a signal. Victoria sat heavily in a nearby chair. "My mother's necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was part of an underground network." Their quiet revelation was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on marble. Clara Winchester strode into the archive room, her surprise at finding them there quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Victoria, I thought I might find you here. The museum board meeting has been moved up." Her eyes flickered to Angela, then to the necklace. "I didn't realize you were conducting research." "Clara," Victoria acknowledged, not moving to hide the photographs. "The meeting isn't for 2 hours." "Oh." Clara moved closer, examining the documents spread across the table. "How fascinating. Your housekeeper seems quite interested in local history. Though shouldn't she be preparing for tonight's dinner party?" The old Victoria might have fumbled, might have sent Angela away to maintain social harmony. But the weight of what they'd just discovered steeled her spine. Angela's grandmother is in these photographs, Clara, as is my mother. They were part of something important, something bigger than social obligations and dinner parties. Clara's smile turned sharp. Darling, you know how I adore your charitable impulses, but there are limits to appropriate familiarity with the help. People are starting to talk. Let them, Victoria said quietly. Clara's composure slipped for a moment. You can't be serious. Your position in society, your influence on the hospital board, your entire way of life, it all depends on maintaining certain standards. Standards set by whom? Angela spoke up, her voice calm but firm. The same people who tried to stop my grandmother from voting? Clara turned as if noticing Angela for the first time. You forget your place. No, Angela replied, standing straighter. For the first time, I'm discovering it. Victoria moved to stand beside Angela. Clara, you should know that Angela and I are working on a presentation about this history for the museum's next fundraiser. I trust we can count on your support. The threat was clear. Clara could either adapt to this changing dynamic or risk appearing on the wrong side of history. Her perfectly manicured hands clenched briefly. Of course, she said tightly, though I wonder if you've considered all the implications. Not everyone will be as understanding as I am. After Clara left, Dr. Thompson cleared his throat. There's one more photograph you should see. He pulled out a final image, this one showing the aftermath of the protests. In it, Dorothy Brown stood proud despite a visible bruise on her face. The necklace was gone. What happened to it? Victoria whispered. According to this, Dr. Thompson handed them a yellowed newspaper clipping. Several protesters' personal items were confiscated. Most were never returned. But my mother had it, Victoria said. She gave it to me before she died. Angela studied the photograph intently. Look at her expression. She knew something we don't. Something worth protecting. Victoria gathered the documents they'd been permitted to copy. We need to find out what happened between this photo and when my mother got the necklace. Whatever it was, it's the key to everything. As they left the museum, both women noticed a dark car idling across the street. Through the tinted windows, they could just make out Clara's silhouette, phone pressed to her ear. She's going to try to stop us, Angela said. Victoria squared her shoulders. Let her try. My mother and your grandmother faced much worse than Clara Winchester's social maneuvering. The necklace caught the morning light, sending green flashes across the museum steps. For a moment, both women could almost feel the weight of history settling around them, pushing them forward into whatever revelations and whatever resistance lay ahead. The Winston Club's private dining room had always been Clara's preferred battlefield. Today, over delicate cups of Earl Grey and untouched scones, she launched her attack. Victoria, darling, I'm only saying this because I care, Clara began, her voice dripping with practiced concern. Your recent association with your housekeeper is raising eyebrows. The hospital board members are particularly concerned. Victoria stirred her tea methodically, buying time. Through the club's floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the city skyline, the same view her mother had contemplated during countless similar confrontations. The board members, Victoria repeated carefully. Or just you, Clara? Don't be difficult. You know how delicate these matters are. Your family's position, your influence in the community, these things require certain standards of behavior. Like the standards that kept Angela's grandmother from entering this very club, Victoria set her cup down with precise control. The standards that my mother apparently chose to challenge? Clara's perfectly composed face showed a flicker of irritation. Your mother understood the importance of maintaining social order while working for change through appropriate channels. This crusade you're on, this public association with servants, it's unseemly. Unseemly, Victoria echoed. Like the unseemly protests that finally ended segregation, the unseemly demands for basic human dignity. That's different, and you know it. Clara leaned forward. I've heard rumors you're planning to feature your housekeeper at the museum fundraiser. Think carefully about this, Victoria. Some of our biggest donors are already expressing concerns. Their concern is noted. Victoria stood, smoothing her skirt, and the presentation will proceed as planned. Angela's grandmother's story, and my mother's role in it, deserves to be told. You're choosing this hill to die on? over a servant and a family story that's better left in the past. No, Clara. I'm choosing to live up to my mother's legacy, something I should have done long ago. Across town, Angela was facing her own battles. The high-end boutique's lighting was designed to flatter, but she felt exposed under the suspicious gazes of the sales staff. Can I help you? The question carried clear implications about Angela's ability to afford anything in the store. She's with me, Victoria said, entering behind her. The staff's demeanor changed instantly, but the damage was done. Angela's hands twisted together uncomfortably. Mrs. Grant, I don't think. Victoria, she corrected gently. And you need appropriate attire for the fundraiser. You're not just serving at this one. You're presenting. The next hour passed in a blur of designer labels and mounting discomfort. Angela felt equally out of place in both the simple sheath dresses the saleswoman suggested and the more elaborate gowns Victoria preferred. This isn't me, Angela said finally, standing in front of a mirror in a dress that cost more than 3 months of her salary. I can't pretend to be something I'm not. Victoria paused, really looking at her for the first time since they'd entered the store. You're right. I'm sorry. I got caught up in trying to make me fit into your world. Yes. Victoria sat heavily on a nearby chair. I'm doing exactly what I accused Clara of doing, trying to force everything into familiar patterns. Angela changed back into her own clothes, feeling more herself. My grandmother didn't change who she was to fight for justice. She didn't need expensive dresses or social approval. No, she didn't. Victoria gathered her purse. Let's get out of here. They ended up in a small coffee shop far from their usual haunts. Over simple cups of coffee, both women felt the tension of the day begin to ease. I heard about your conversation with Clara, Angela said finally. The other staff, they talk. Of course they do. Victoria's Maid Raili. Clara's probably counting on that. Are you really willing to risk your position? Your influence? The hospital board can find another socialite to chair their committees. Victoria's voice was firm. But this story, your grandmother's courage, my mother's secret support, this necklace that connects us all, it's more important than maintaining Clara's precious social order. Angela touched the necklace thoughtfully. But you could do more good from your position. My grandmother understood that about your mother, why she had to work within the system even while secretly supporting change. Maybe, Victoria stared into her coffee. Or maybe that's just what we tell ourselves to justify maintaining comfortable distances. The safe separations between us and them, upstairs and downstairs, past and present. The coffee shop's evening crowd began to filter in, young professionals and students mixing easily. No one gave a second glance to the unlikely pair in their corner booth, the elegantly dressed society woman and her housekeeper sharing coffee and conversation. I don't want to cost you everything you've worked for, Angela said softly. You're not. You're helping me understand what it's really worth. Victoria Straten. But you're right about one thing, we don't need to play by their rules. The fundraiser presentation doesn't need designer dresses or social polish. It needs truth. Truth can be dangerous, Angela warned. So was wearing this necklace at a civil rights protest. Victoria's eyes sparked with something like her mother's fire. Yet our grandmothers thought it was worth the risk. As they left the coffee shop, the setting sun cast long shadows across the city streets. Somewhere in her mansion, Clara was likely making calls, pulling strings, trying to maintain her version of social order. But here, in the gathering dusk, two women from different worlds walked together, united by a legacy symbolized in emerald and gold, and by the growing determination to live up to it, whatever the cost. The Grant Mansion's library had become their war room. Documents, photographs, and letters covered every surface as Victoria and Angela Prepa read for the museum fundraiser. The presentation they were crafting wasn't just about the necklace anymore. It had evolved into a broader story about privilege, resistance, and unexpected alliances. Look at this, Angela said, carefully unfolding another of her grandfather's letters. There's a mention of a meeting at St. Mark's Church basement in 1963. Apparently, that's where my grandmother first met your mother. Victoria cross-referenced the date with her mother's old social calendar. Mother listed it as ladies' auxiliary tea that day. She was building alibis, creating a paper trail of innocent social engagements. Their work was interrupted by Victoria's phone buzzing. The text message was anonymous. Consider carefully what secrets you expose. Some stories are better left untold. Angela noticed Victoria's expression darken. What is it? Nothing, Victoria said automatically, then caught herself. No, I promised no more secrets between us. Someone's trying to warn us off. She showed Angela the message. Clara, possibly. Or someone else who wants to maintain the comfortable fiction that families like mine were always on the right side of history. Victoria's laugh was bitter, as if there was anything comfortable about what our grandmothers did. The doorbell rang, echoing through the mansion. Moments later, Harrison, the elderly butler, appeared in the library doorway. Mrs. Grant, Mr. Ryan Cooper is here to see you. Victoria Stefanet. Ryan Cooper, her ex-fiancé and current chairman of the museum board's fundraising committee. Angela began gathering the documents, but Victoria stopped her. No, leave them. It's time we stop hiding. Ryan entered with his usual polished charm, but his smile faltered at the sight of Angela sitting comfortably among the family portraits and leather-bound books. Victoria, I hope we could discuss the upcoming fundraiser. His eyes lingered on the necklace around Angela's neck. Privately. Anything you need to say can be said in front of Angela, Victoria replied. She's co-presenting with me. Ryan's facade cracked slightly. That's actually what I came to discuss. The board has some concerns about the direction you're taking with this presentation. The direction of historical truth? The direction of controversy. Ryan moved closer, lowering his voice despite his supposed acceptance of Angela's presence. Some of our most significant donors have deep roots in this community, Victoria. Roots that might be portrayed unflatteringly by this historical exploration. You mean they're afraid we'll expose which families actively oppose civil rights? Victoria's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Which pillars of the community tried to maintain segregation? This isn't just about you anymore, Ryan warned. Think about the hospital wing that needs funding. The children's programs that depend on donor support. Angela stood quietly. I should go. No, Victoria said sharply. Ryan, you should know that Angela's grandmother, Dorothy Brown, was a civil rights leader. The necklace she's wearing connected our families during those struggles. It's a story that deserves to be told. A story that could damage a lot of reputations, Ryan countered, including yours. Not everyone will understand your friendship with your housekeeper. The word friendship carried ugly implications in his mouth. Victoria felt a familiar pressure to conform, to maintain social harmony at all costs. But then she remembered the photograph of Dorothy Brown, standing proud despite her bruises, and her mother's secret support of the movement. The presentation goes forward as planned, she said firmly. Ryan's charm vanished entirely. Then you leave me no choice. The board will need to review all material before it's presented. And Victoria, you might want to check the donor agreements your mother signed. There are interesting clauses about maintaining the museum's community. Tie standards. After he left, Angela broke the tense silence. He's right about one thing. This isn't just about us anymore. People's livelihoods depend on that donor money. Victoria was already on her laptop, pulling up old donor agreements. There has to be a way to tell the truth without. Her voice trailed off as she opened an email that had just arrived. Inside was a single image, a newspaper clipping from 1963 showing Eleanor Grant at a society function, wearing the necklace just days after it had supposedly been confiscated from Dorothy Brown. The implied threat was clear. Tell this story, and we'll destroy your mother's reputation too. They're trying to pit us against each other, Angela said quietly. Make us choose between protecting the past and building a better future. Victoria stared at the photograph, remembering her mother's final words about the necklace. It's not just jewelry. It's a reminder. What if, Victoria said slowly, there's more to this story than even they know? What if my mother wearing the necklace publicly wasn't a betrayal, but part of the plan? Angela leaned in to study the photograph more closely. The article mentions she wore it to a fundraiser for the hospital. The same hospital wing they're using to blackmail us now. Victoria's eyes lit up with sudden understanding. Mother wasn't just protecting her social position. She was using it. Another anonymous text arrived. Final warning. Withdraw from the fundraiser or face the consequences. Victoria looked at Angela, saw the same determination she felt reflected in her friend's eyes. They think they can scare us with old photographs and vague threats. They don't know who they're dealing with, Angela agreed, touching the necklace. Our grandmothers faced much worse. Then we move forward, Victoria decided. But first, we need to understand exactly what happened at that hospital fundraiser in 1963. Because I think we're missing something huge, something that could change everything. The library grew darker as evening fell, but neither woman moved to turn on the lights. They sat among the scattered evidence of their shared history, two unlikely allies planning their own quiet revolution, while somewhere in the city, forces were gathering to stop them. The necklace caught the last rays of sunlight, its emerald gleaming like a defiant green eye, watching history repeat itself in new ways. The museum's grand hall hummed with nervous energy. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow over the city's elite, gathered in their finest for what they thought would be another routine fundraiser. Victoria stood at the entrance, greeting guests with practiced ease while scanning the crowd for potential allies and enemies. Clara had positioned herself strategically near the podium, surrounded by key board members. Her smile was sharp as cut glass when she caught Victoria's eye. Beside her, Ryan shifted uncomfortably, checking his phone for what must have been the 100th time. Mrs. Winchester is saying you've lost your mind, Harrison murmured as he passed with a tray of champagne. The elderly butler had served the Grant family for 40 years. But the kitchen staff, they're all behind you and Miss Angela. Victoria nodded almost imperceptibly. The battle lines had been drawn in unexpected ways. The household staff, usually invisible to these grand gatherings, were watching from the margins with unveiled interest. Angela entered through a side door, and the subtle shift in the room was palpable. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her own choice, not the designer options Victoria had suggested. The necklace caught the light, drawing every eye in the room. That's Eleanor Grant's necklace, someone whispered loudly enough to carry. On the housekeeper, Clara made her move quickly, intercepting Angela before she could reach Victoria. Angela, dear, we're rather short-staffed tonight. Would you mind helping? In the kitchen? Actually, Angela replied with quiet dignity. I'm here as a presenter. Oh. Clara's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. How progressive of Victoria. Though perhaps we should focus on the hospital wing funding tonight. These historical discussions can be so divisive. Victoria started forward, but Angela caught her eye and gave a slight shake of her head. This was her battle to fight. Mrs. Winchester, Angela said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. My grandmother taught me that divisions exist only when we choose to maintain them. The necklace I'm wearing belonged to both our families. Its story belongs to this whole community. Clara's smile froze. Some stories are better left untold. Like the story of how this hospital wing was really funded in 1963, Angela touched the necklace. Or why Eleanor Grant wore this to that particular fundraiser. A sudden hush fell over the nearest guests. Clara's composure slipped for just a moment, showing genuine fear beneath the polished surface. Ryan appeared at Clara's elbow. Ladies, perhaps this isn't the best venue for Dash. It's exactly the right venue, Victoria interrupted, joining them. Mother chose this same room, this same crowd, to make her stand 60 years ago. Victoria, Ryan hissed, think about what you're doing. The hospital funding dash will continue. A new voice cut in. Margaret Whitmore, the eldest board member, made her way through the crowd with her cane tapping sharply against the marble floor. Just as it did in 1963, when Eleanor Grant exposed the segregated funding practices that were killing people in our community. The room went deathly quiet. Margaret's age and position made her impossible to silence or ignore. Oh yes, she continued, her voice carrying clearly. I was there. Eleanor wore that necklace, the same one Dorothy Brown had worn at the protests, and revealed how certain families were preventing hospital funds from reaching the entire community. She threatened to expose everyone involved unless the hospital was properly integrated. Clara tried to interrupt, but Margaret silenced her with a look. She used her position, her social standing, to force change from within, just as her daughter is doing now. Victoria felt tears threatening. All this time, she thought her mother's social climbing had been about maintaining position and privilege. Instead, she'd been fighting her own kind of war. "The presentation will proceed as planned," Margaret announced to the room at large. "And I suggest those with concerns remember their own family histories before objecting too strongly." Clara's face had gone pale. Ryan was already retreating toward the bar. But Victoria barely noticed them. She was watching Angela, who stood straight and proud, her grandmother's spirit shining through her eyes. "Your mother used this necklace as a weapon," Angela said softly to Victoria. "Not of division, but of truth." "And now we'll do the same," Victoria replied. They made their way to the podium together, ignoring the murmurs and stares. The projector hummed to life, displaying the first image, Dorothy Brown and Eleanor Grant, standing together at St. Mark's Church, the necklace passing between them like a promise. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice steady, "we're here tonight to share a story about two women who refused to accept the world as it was. A story about courage, friendship, and the power of unlikely allies. A story symbolized by this necklace, which has finally come full circle." Angela stepped forward, and in that moment, she wasn't a housekeeper speaking to her social betters. She was her grandmother's granddaughter, carrying forward a legacy of quiet revolution. "My grandmother once said that change doesn't always come with banners and protests," Angela began. "Sometimes it comes through whispered truths and silent witnesses, through small acts of outrage that ripple outward until they can't be ignored." The necklace gleamed under the chandeliers, its emerald heart pulsing like a green flame of truth, burning away decades of careful silence. In the back of the room, the household staff stood witness, their usual invisibility forgotten. Harrison dabbed at his eyes with a starched handkerchief. And somewhere, Victoria felt certain, Eleanor Grant and Dorothy Brown were watching their legacy unfold in ways they had only dreamed possible. The presentation's final slide faded to black, leaving the grand hall in a charged silence. Photographs of segregated hospital wards had given way to donation records showing systematic discrimination, then to evidence of Eleanor Grant's careful documentation of it all. The necklace had appeared in key moments throughout, a green thread weaving past to present. The quiet lasted exactly 3 seconds before the room erupted. "My father's name was in those records," a young doctor said, rising from his seat. "He always claimed our family supported integration, but those numbers." The Green Foundation's donations were clearly marked general use, but never reached the East Side facilities, another board member noted, shuffling through the printed materials Victoria had distributed. "Mother worked in that segregated ward," an elderly black woman near the front said softly. "She always said Mrs. Grant was different from the others. Now we know why." Clara stood frozen by the bar, her carefully constructed world crumbling as more people began to speak. Decades of carefully maintained social fiction were dissolving in the face of documented truth. "The thing about history," Margaret Whitmore announced, tapping her cane for attention, "is that it doesn't stay buried." Eleanor knew that. She kept meticulous records, waited for the right moment, then used this very necklace, this symbol of privilege, to force change. Victoria watched as the revelations rippled through the crowd. Board members who had arrived ready to suppress the presentation were now huddled in corners, whispering urgently about damage control. Others were approaching Angela, asking about Dorothy Brown's work with the civil rights movement. "Your grandmother," a prominent surgeon said to Angela, "she organized the health clinics in the East Side neighborhoods, didn't she? The ones that served people turned away from the main hospital." Angela nodded. "She worked with a network of supporters, including Eleanor Grant, who used her social position to channel supplies and funding their way. While wearing this necklace at society functions," Victoria added, "hiding in plain sight, using the very symbols of privilege to undermine the system that created them." Ryan Cooper appeared at Victoria's elbow, his face ashen. "The donor agreements, some of these families could sue." "For what?" Victoria challenged. "For exposing that their grandparents tried to maintain segregation." Let them try. The publicity would be fascinating. Across the room, Clara was attempting to salvage something from the wreckage. Surely we can acknowledge past mistakes while maintaining certain social standards, she was saying to anyone who would listen. The natural order the natural order? A young socialite interrupted. Like keeping qualified doctors out of hospitals because of their race? Like my grandfather did, according to these records? Times were different then, Clara protested weakly. And they're different now, Angela said, her voice carrying. Because people like my grandmother and Mrs. Grant chose to make them different. The museum curator hurried forward with barely contained excitement. Ms. Brown, these documents, they're invaluable historical records. Would you consider allowing us to create a permanent exhibition? I think, Victoria interjected, that decision should be made jointly. The story belongs to both our families. To the whole community. Huh. Risen appeared with fresh champagne, his usual professional mask slipping to show pride as he served Angela first. Other staff members had emerged from the shadows, standing straighter, looking guests in the eye. You know what this means for the hospital board, Margaret said quietly to Victoria. Changes will have to be made. Real changes, not just cosmetic ones. Victoria watched as board members who had tried to silence them earlier now scrambled to align themselves with the right side of history. Mother knew this would happen eventually. She left those records for a reason. But she needed someone brave enough to use them, Angela added. Both of you and your mother, risked your social position to do what's right. A young black nurse approached them hesitantly. My grandmother used to talk about the secret clinics, about the white lady who wore an emerald necklace and brought supplies after dark. We thought they were just stories. They were never just stories, Victoria said firmly. They were truth waiting to be told. As the evening wound down, the impact of their revelation continued to spread. People who had never spoken beyond social pleasantries were engaged in intense discussions about history and responsibility. Younger members of old families were questioning their inherited narratives. Staff members were being asked their names for the first time by guests who had ignored them for years. It's like watching a wall crumble, Angela observed. Not all at once, but crack by crack. Victoria touched the necklace that still hung around Angela's neck. Mother used to say that real change happens in moments of truth, when we can't pretend anymore about who we are and what we've done. Through the grand windows, they could see camera flashes. Local reporters, drawn by urgent calls from attendees, were gathering outside. Tomorrow, the story would spread beyond these walls, forcing more conversations, more reckonings. Are you ready for what comes next? Angela asked softly. Victoria looked around the room, at Clara's retreating back, at the animated discussions between guests and staff, at the young people furiously taking notes on their phones, at Margaret Whitmore holding court with a group of board members. Mother was ready, she said finally. Grandmother was ready. How can we be any less? The necklace caught the light one final time that evening, its emerald heart steady and true, watching as the careful lies of generations began to unravel in the face of long-hidden truth. The morning after the fundraiser, Victoria's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news outlets wanted statements. Social media was buzzing with photographs of the presentation. The hospital board had called an emergency meeting, but it was the scene in her kitchen that held her attention. Angela was preparing coffee as usual, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Harrison and the other staff moved around her with open respect, no longer pretending not to notice the necklace. They spoke freely about the previous night's events, their usual careful silence replaced by passionate discussion. My mother worked in those segregated wards, Mrs. Peterson, the cook, said as she kneaded bread dough. All these years, I never told anyone here. Felt like it wasn't my place. Everything was about place back then, Harrison added, his usual formality softening. And look where got us. The kitchen's atmosphere of open conversation scattered when Clara arrived unannounced, her Hermes heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Victoria, we need to talk. Clara's voice was tight with controlled fury. Privately. Anything you have to say can be said here, Victoria replied, not moving from her seat at the kitchen island. We're done with private conversations and hidden truths. Clara's perfectly maintained facade cracked slightly. Do you have any idea what you've done? The calls I've been getting? The W. Atson Foundation is threatening to withdraw all funding. The hospital board is in chaos. Generations of relationships, carefully maintained social structures dash. Carefully maintained oppression, you mean, Angela interrupted, setting down a coffee cup with deliberate precision. That's what those social structures were built on, weren't they? Clara turned on her, finally dropping all pretense of civility. You. This is all because of you. You couldn't just be grateful for your position here, couldn't just do your job quietly like everyone else. You had to dig up the past, had to corrupt Victoria with these ideas. These ideas were my mother's, Victoria said sharply, and Angela's grandmother's. We're just continuing their work. Your mother understood discretion, Clara snapped. She worked within the system dash. She documented the system's crimes, Victoria corrected. She left evidence specifically so the truth could come out when the time was right. And now what? Clara demanded. You think exposing old sins will change anything? You'll just destroy everything we've built, everything we maintain for the good of the community. For whose good? Angela asked quietly. The kitchen staff had gone still, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Clara's laugh was bitter. Look around you. Who funds the hospitals? The schools? The charity programs? You think exposing the past sins of prominent families will help anyone? They'll just withdraw their support. And then what? Then we build something better, Victoria said firmly. Something based on truth and equality, not manipulation and shame. Clara pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly. I've spent the morning making calls. Remember Thomas Richmond? His family's foundation funds the children's wing. He's willing to help contain this situation, but there are conditions. What conditions? Victoria asked, though she already knew. Retract the presentation. Say it was a misunderstanding, that the documents were taken out of context. Distance yourself from certain associations. Clara's eyes flickered to Angela. Return to the natural order of things. The kitchen was silent except for the steady thump of Mrs. Peterson's kneading. Then Angela spoke, her voice clear and strong. My grandmother faced worse threats than withdrawn donations. She taught me that real change only comes when we refuse to be silenced. Victoria stood, moving to stand beside Angela. The answer is no, Clara. And you can tell Thomas Richmond that if he withdraws funding over exposed truth, we'll make sure everyone knows why. You're choosing this servant over your own class, your own people. I'm choosing truth over comfortable lies. Just like my mother did. Clara's composure finally shattered completely. Your precious mother wasn't the saint you think she was. There are other documents, other stories. Things that could tarnish her legacy forever. More threats, Clara? Really? Victoria's voice was ice. Release whatever you want. The truth is already out there, spreading through every social circle, every hospital board meeting, every household staff conversation in the city. You can't stop it anymore. As if to prove her point, Harrison's phone buzzed with a news alert. The local paper's headline read, Historic Hospital Segregation Exposed. Prominent Families Implicated. Clara stared at the headline, her face draining of color. This will destroy everything. No, Angela said quietly. It will rebuild everything. Better this time. Mrs. Peterson had stopped kneading her bread. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron and spoke for the first time. My grandson just got accepted to medical school. Maybe now he'll work in a hospital built on truth instead of secrets. Clara looked around the kitchen, seeing for the first time how many witnesses were watching her desperate attempt to maintain control. Her carefully constructed world of societal hierarchies and unspoken rules was crumbling in a simple kitchen, surrounded by people she'd spent a lifetime pretending not to see. You'll regret this, she said finally, but her voice had lost its power. Both of you. As she turned to leave, Victoria called after her. Clara? Mother kept records of everything, including who helped her smuggle supplies to those secret clinics. You might want to check your own family history before you start throwing stones. The kitchen door swung shut behind Clara's retreating form. In the silence that followed, Angela touched the necklace thoughtfully. They'll keep coming, she said. Others like her, trying to maintain the old ways. Victoria smiled, reaching for her phone as it buzzed with another news alert. Let them come. We have something they don't. What's that? Truth. And each other. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, catching the emerald's green fire. Outside, reporters were gathering at the gates. Inside, the old barriers were finally, irrevocably coming down. 3 days after the fundraiser, Ryan Cooper arrived at the Grant Mansion unannounced. The media storm hadn't subsided. If anything, it had intensified as more families came forward with their own stories of segregation and resistance. Victoria almost turned him away, but something in his expression gave her pause. "You need to see this," he said, holding up a worn leather briefcase. "My grandfather's papers. I found them last night after everything came out." Victoria led him to the library, where Angela was already working, surrounded by newspaper clippings and interview requests. The necklace caught the morning light as she looked up, and Ryan flinched visibly. "I knew I'd seen it before," he said quietly. "Not just at society functions, but in my grandfather's study. He had a photograph." His hands shook slightly as he opened the briefcase. Inside lay a collection of yellowed papers and photographs, carefully preserved. He pulled out one image that made both women gasp. It showed a group of people in what appeared to be a basement room. Dorothy Brown stood at the center, wearing the necklace. Beside her was Eleanor Grant. And there, in the background, was a young man Victoria recognized as Ryan's grandfather. December 1963, Ryan read from the back. "The night of the hospital board vote. The vote that officially maintained segregation," Victoria said. "Mother spoke against it, but was outvoted." "That's what the official records show," Ryan agreed. "But according to my grandfather's journal, that wasn't the whole story." He pulled out a leather-bound notebook, opening to a marked page. "Listen to this. Tonight we sealed the pact. Eleanor wore the necklace to the board meeting as planned, appearing to accept their decision. Meanwhile, Dorothy led the others through the tunnel. By morning, it would be too late to stop what we'd set in motion." Angela leaned forward. "What tunnel?" "The old service tunnel," Ryan explained. "It connected the main hospital to the East Wing. Officially, it was sealed off to maintain segregation. But that night..." Victoria's eyes widened. While Mother kept the board occupied, Dorothy and her team moved through the tunnel, integrating the hospital from within, Ryan finished. They moved patients, redistributed supplies, destroyed the segregation signs. By morning, the situation was too mixed to easily reverse. "And the necklace?" Angela touched it unconsciously. Ryan pulled out one final document. It was their signal. When Eleanor wore it publicly, it meant the board's attention was diverted. When Dorothy wore it, it meant the underground network was active. They passed it back and forth for months, coordinating their efforts. "That's why it seemed to be in two places at once," Victoria breathed. "All those photographs. They used the society pages against them," Ryan said. "Every time Eleanor was photographed. Wearing it at a function, Dorothy's people were making moves elsewhere. The board was so focused on maintaining appearances, they never saw the real change happening right under their noses. Until it was too late to stop it," Angela finished. "But why didn't they tell anyone? Why leave the truth hidden for so long?" "Protection," Victoria realized. As long as everyone thought Mother was just another society woman who occasionally supported good causes, she could keep working from the inside, Ryan agreed. And Dorothy could keep building support in the community. The necklace was their way of coordinating without risking exposure. He spread more papers across the desk. "There's more. Lists of supporters, details of supply routes, names of doctors who secretly treated patients regardless of race. My grandfather. He was their liaison on the hospital board. He recorded everything." "Why are you showing us this now?" Victoria asked quietly. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older. "Because I've spent my whole career playing the same games they fought against. Maintaining appearances, preserving systems that should have died decades ago. When you showed those documents at the fundraiser, I recognized my grandfather's handwriting in some of them." Angela studied him carefully. "And now I think it's time to finish what they started." He gestured to the papers. "These records, they show how deep the network went. How many people secretly supported integration while publicly maintaining the status quo, including families that are still trying to control things today." Victoria thought of Clara's threats, her desperate attempts to maintain social order. You understand what releasing these records would mean? The hospital board needs to change, Ryan said firmly. Real change this time, not just surface adjustments. Angela picked up one of the photographs, studying the faces of those long-ago allies. They weren't just fighting segregation in the hospital, were they? They were building a blueprint for dismantling the whole system. A blueprint we can finally use, Victoria said. She looked at Ryan. Are you sure about this? You'll face the same backlash we are. He smiled sadly. My grandfather wrote that his only regret was not doing more openly. I don't want to carry the same regret. The library fell quiet as the weight of history settled around them. Outside, they could hear reporters still gathered at the gates, demanding comments about the growing scandal. But in here, surrounded by evidence of their grandparents' secret resistance, the path forward was becoming clear. So, Angela said finally, touching the necklace one last time before reaching to unclasp it. Who should wear it now? Victoria stopped her. Keep it. It was never about ownership. It was about partnership, about different people from different worlds working together for real change. Ryan gathered his grandfather's papers carefully. Shall we finish what they started? Victoria looked at Angela, saw her own determination reflected back. They gave us the blueprint and the courage to use it. The necklace caught the light one final time, its emerald heart pulsing with the same fire that had lit the way for Eleanor and Dorothy's quiet revolution. Their legacy hadn't ended with integrated hospital wards or dismantled social barriers. It lived on in the choices of their grandchildren, who finally understood that real change comes not from grand gestures, but from small acts of courage multiplied across generations. Well, Victoria said, reaching for the phone, let's call a press conference. It's time everyone knew the whole story. The morning sun streamed through the library windows, illuminating three unlikely allies surrounded by proof of an older alliance. Outside, the world was changing. Inside, history was rising to meet the present, carried forward on a chain of gold and emerald connecting past to future through the power of shared courage and unexpected friendship.